Are we in end times? Every generation thinks so, but what makes current times so different from the first-century Christians who watched Nero burn their families in his gardens and believed the end was days away? What makes us different from the medieval peasants who saw the Black Death sweep away half of Europe and calculated that the Four Horsemen had finally been unleashed? What makes us different from the Millerites who sold their possessions in 1844, climbed hillsides waiting for Jesus to descend, and woke up on October 22nd to a world that continued as if nothing had happened? The pattern is undeniable. The Roman Christians saw the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 after Christ and believed the end had come. The Europeans of the 14th century saw the collapse of the feudal order and the rise of the Ottoman Turks and believed Gog and Magog were at the gates. Every generation, facing its own wars, its own disasters, its own tyrants, has concluded that it is living in the final chapter of history. The question is not whether we feel that way today. The question is whether our feeling is different, or whether we are simply repeating an ancient human habit, reading our own anxieties into sacred texts and seeing our own reflection in the prophecies of the past. The term for the study of the end times is eschatology, and it is not a fringe interest confined to obscure sects. It has shaped the course of history, launching crusades, inspiring revolutions, and giving comfort to the suffering across millennia. But it has also produced a long and sobering record of failed predictions. William Miller's great disappointment of 1844 did not end the pattern, it refined it. Harold Camping's failed Rapture prediction in 2011 did not dismantle his ministry, it merely led his followers to reinterpret what had happened. This pattern is driven by psychology as much as theology. Human beings cannot tolerate meaninglessness. When wars rage, institutions crumble, and the future feels uncertain, the end times narrative offers a promise that the chaos is not random, that the suffering is not pointless, that the darkness is the birth pangs of a new creation. It is a narrative that has been irresistible to every generation, and it is precisely because it is so compelling that we must ask ourselves the uncomfortable question. If every generation before us was wrong, why should we believe that our generation is right? This documentary is built on that tension. We will walk through the original prophecies, the words of Jesus on the Mount of Olives, the visions of Daniel in Babylon, the revelation of John on Patmos, the words of Ezekiel about Gog and Magog. We will see how these prophecies have been interpreted across history, from the early church to the Reformation to the modern prophecy movement. We will examine the key events that shape modern end times belief, the birth of dispensationalism with John Nelson Darby, the rebirth of Israel in 1948, the Six-Day War in 1967, the Temple Movement, and the Red Heifers. And then we will turn to March of 2026, to the wars in Ukraine, in Gaza, in the Red Sea, to the tensions with Iran, to the Strait of Hormuz, to the drying Euphrates, to the digital identity systems and the WHO pandemic agreement, and we will ask the same question that every generation has asked. Are these the signs that the prophets saw? Or are we seeing what every generation has seen, the reflection of our own fears in the mirror of ancient texts? The answer is not simple. It is not a matter of dismissing prophecy as superstition or embracing it as a detailed map of the future. It is a matter of holding the tension, of taking the prophecies seriously without taking every interpretation as certainty, of watching the signs without being alarmed, of living with urgency without living in fear. And that is the journey we will take together in the chapters that follow. Before we continue, please support the channel by liking the video, hitting the hype button, and subscribing to help us grow. We greatly appreciate your support. 605 BC. Daniel's prophecies, the statue, the beasts, and the final kingdom. The year is roughly 605 before Christ, and a young Hebrew named Daniel finds himself in Babylon, a city so magnificent that the hanging gardens within it would later be counted among the wonders of the ancient world. But Daniel is not a tourist admiring the architecture. He has been taken from his homeland, his temple has been destroyed, his people have been scattered, and he now serves in the court of King Nebuchadnezzar, a ruler whose ego was matched only by his cruelty. One night the king has a dream that shakes him to his core. He sees a massive statue with a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and feet made of iron mixed with clay. Then, in the vision, a stone cut not by human hands strikes the statue at its feet and shatters it completely, grinding the metals into dust that blows away like chaff on a summer threshing floor. The stone then grows into a mountain that fills the whole earth. Nebuchadnezzar demands that his wise men interpret the dream, but none can. Only Daniel, guided by the God he serves, steps forward with an explanation that would echo through every empire to come. Daniel tells the king that the head of gold represents Nebuchadnezzar himself and the Babylonian Empire, a kingdom of unmatched splendor and absolute authority. But Babylon will not last forever. Another kingdom, inferior to Babylon, represented by the silver chest and arms, will rise to take its place. That kingdom would be Media-Persia, a vast empire that indeed conquered Babylon just a few decades later. Then a third kingdom of bronze will rule over the whole earth, a kingdom that would be Greece under Alexander the Great, whose armies swept across the known world with terrifying speed. The fourth kingdom, represented by the legs of iron, would be Rome, a power unlike any before it, crushing and breaking everything in its path. But here is where the prophecy becomes endlessly debated. The feet and toes, a mixture of iron and clay, represent a final form of that fourth kingdom, a divided and brittle power that cannot hold together. In the days of those kings, Daniel says, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, a kingdom that will crush all those previous empires and stand forever. This was not just a prediction for ancient listeners. It was a promise that human history had a direction, that empires rise and fall by divine design, and that a final kingdom was coming that would not be made by human hands. But Daniel did not stop with Nebuchadnezzar's statue. In Daniel chapter 7, written during the reign of Belshazzar, the prophet receives his own vision, one even more disturbing and symbolic than the king's dream. Daniel sees the four winds of heaven churning up the great sea, and out of the sea emerge four great beasts, each one different from the others. The first is like a lion with eagle's wings, representing Babylon in its swift conquest and predatory power. The second is like a bear raised up on one side with three ribs in its mouth, representing Media-Persia and its brutal expansion. The third is like a leopard with four wings and four heads, representing Greece and the rapid spread of Alexander's empire before it fractured into four parts after his death. Then comes the fourth beast, terrifying and dreadful, with iron teeth and 10 horns. This beast, which scholars almost universally identify as Rome, is unlike any that came before it, a power of such destructive force that it devours and crushes everything. But then Daniel sees something that changes everything. Among the 10 horns, a little horn appears, and before it 3 of the original horns are uprooted. This little horn has eyes like human eyes and a mouth that speaks boastful things, and it wages war against the saints, wearing them down until the Ancient of Days takes his seat in judgment. The meaning of the little horn has been debated for centuries. Some early Christian writers identified it with Antiochus Epiphanes, the Seleucid king who desecrated the temple in Jerusalem in the 2nd century before Christ. Others saw it as a reference to the Roman emperors who persecuted the church. Later interpreters, particularly in the Protestant Reformation, saw the little horn as the papacy, a political and religious power that they believed had corrupted the church and persecuted true believers. In the modern era, the little horn has been attached to Napoleon, to Hitler, to Stalin, to various European leaders, and to any figure who seems to embody the combination of political power, arrogance, and hostility to faith. But the most important aspect of Daniel's vision is not the identity of the little horn itself. It is the structure Daniel establishes. History moves through a sequence of empires, each one giving way to the next, until a final, fragile, divided form of the last empire, gives way to the kingdom of God. This structure became the backbone for nearly every later theory about the end times. If you wanted to understand where you stood in God's timeline, you needed to figure out which empire you were living under and how close you were to the final one. For the early church living under Rome, the answer seemed obvious. For medieval Christians watching the Roman Empire fragment, the feat of iron and clay felt immediate. And for modern interpreters who see the European Union or a revived Roman alliance as the final form of the Fourth Kingdom, the prophecy feels as fresh as this morning's headlines. What makes Daniel's prophecies so enduring is that they offer a map of history that feels both specific and flexible. The specific parts are remarkable. Daniel correctly predicted the rise of Persia, Greece, and Rome centuries before they dominated the world stage. But the flexible parts allow each generation to see its own conflicts within the framework. The iron and clay do not stick together, Daniel said, meaning the final form of the Fourth Kingdom will be internally divided, weak in its unity. Every generation since Rome fell has looked at the fractured politics of its own era and seen that description. The toes are both iron and clay, partly strong and partly brittle. For someone watching the European Union struggle with internal dissent in 2026, the image feels almost designed for current events. The key to understanding Daniel is to recognize that the prophecy was never meant to be a detailed timeline that you could map onto a calendar. It was meant to be a theological argument that history has a plot, that human power always fails, and that God's kingdom is the only empire that will ultimately stand. When Jesus spoke to his disciples about the end of the age, he was drawing on this prophetic tradition, expanding it and inviting his followers to live with the tension of a kingdom that had already arrived in him but had not yet fully come in its final form. Daniel's visions set the stage for everything that followed in apocalyptic literature, from the Dead Sea Scrolls to the Book of Revelation, and they remain the single most important Old Testament foundation for how Christians think about the end of the world. 58 BC, Matthew's End Times Prophecy. On the Mount of Olives, a ridge of limestone hills that rises just east of Jerusalem, you can stand today and look across the Kidron Valley at the city's eastern wall. In the 1st century, from this same vantage point, you would have seen the Second Temple in all its glory, a structure so magnificent that ancient historians said those who had never seen it had never seen true beauty. Jesus of Nazareth walked these slopes often, and in the final week of his life, he sat down with his closest followers on this very hillside to answer a question that would shape Christian expectation for 2,000 years. They had just come from the temple, and Jesus had made a shocking prediction. He said that not one stone of that magnificent structure would remain upon another. Every single one would be thrown down. Later, as they sat on the Mount of Olives overlooking the city, the disciples asked him 2 questions. When will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? The answer Jesus gave them, recorded in Matthew chapter 24, Mark chapter 13, and Luke chapter 21, became the foundational text for Christian end times thinking, a discourse so influential that it has been preached, debated, and analyzed more than almost any other passage in Scripture. Jesus begins with a warning that many modern readers skip over too quickly. He tells his disciples that many will come in his name claiming to be the Messiah, and they will deceive many. He tells them they will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but they should not be alarmed because these things must happen, but the end is not yet. This is a crucial distinction that often gets lost in modern prophecy teaching. Wars, earthquakes, famines, these are all described by Jesus as birth pains, the beginning of sorrows, but they are not the final event. They are the prelude, the context in which history moves toward its conclusion, not the conclusion itself. Jesus was preparing his disciples for a long period of waiting, a period in which wars would come and go, in which natural disasters would strike, in which false prophets would rise and fall, but in which the final end would remain in the future. The disciples, like many believers after them, likely expected that end to come within their own lifetimes. But Jesus was telling them to pace themselves, to understand that the period between his ascension and his return would be marked by ongoing crisis, and that crisis alone was not proof that the end had arrived. After describing these general signs, Jesus moves to more specific warnings about persecution. He tells his followers that they will be handed over to local councils and flogged in synagogues. They will stand before governors and kings as witnesses. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father will betray his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. He says that because lawlessness will increase, the love of many will grow cold. This description of persecution, family division, and widespread moral collapse has been applied to nearly every era of church history. The early Christians experienced it under Nero and Domitian. The medieval church faced it from both internal corruption and external threats. The Reformers saw it in the persecution of Protestants by Catholic authorities and vice versa. In the modern era, Christians in various parts of the world face persecution that matches these descriptions with terrifying precision. But Jesus adds a crucial promise in the middle of this dark forecast. He says that the one who stands firm to the end will be saved, and then he makes a statement that has caused more debate than almost any other in the discourse. He says that the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. This statement has fueled missionary movements, Bible translation efforts, and a constant debate about whether the gospel has truly reached all nations. In the first century, when the disciples heard these words, the known world was largely the Roman Empire, a territory that had not yet heard the gospel widely. In the 21st century, the question becomes more complex. Has the gospel been preached to every nation? If by nation we mean every distinct ethnic group or language group, the answer is not yet, though progress has been remarkable. If by nation we mean every political entity, the gospel has been present in almost every country on earth. But Jesus did not give a timeline. He did not say that the end would come immediately after the gospel reached all nations. He said that when it had been preached as a testimony to all nations, then the end would come. This was a condition that placed the timing of the end partly in the hands of the church itself. A strange and humbling responsibility that has motivated generations of missionaries to go to the ends of the earth. Then Jesus describes what he calls the abomination of desolation, a phrase drawn from the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place. He tells those in Judea to flee to the mountains immediately when they see this, and he adds that it will be a time of great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. For first-century readers, this language would have immediately called to mind the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 after Christ, when Roman armies surrounded the city, slaughtered its inhabitants, and burned the temple to the ground. The historian Josephus described the siege in terms that match Jesus' warnings with uncanny precision. The Christians in Jerusalem, according to early church tradition, remembered Jesus' words and fled to the city of Pella across the Jordan River, escaping the destruction that claimed over 1 million Jewish lives. For many scholars, this historical fulfillment is the primary meaning of the Olivet Discourse. Jesus was warning his disciples about the coming judgment on Jerusalem, a judgment that would fall within their generation, just as he said. But the discourse also looks beyond that event to a future coming of the Son of Man, a cosmic event that will be unmistakable and universal. Jesus says that immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and all the peoples of the earth will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. This is not a subtle event. It is not something that can be missed or misinterpreted. Jesus contrasts it with the birth pains and the wars and rumors of wars precisely to make this point. The final coming will be like lightning that flashes from the east to the west, visible to everyone. No one will need to interpret it. No prophecy teacher will need to explain it. It will be obvious and undeniable. This is the tension at the heart of the Olivet Discourse. There are signs that point toward the end: wars, earthquakes, persecution, the preaching of the gospel, the abomination of desolation. But the final event itself is not signaled by signs. It breaks into history suddenly, unexpectedly, and universally. And that is why Jesus concludes with his most famous warning: no one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, he says. Be alert. You do not know when that time will come. 95 AD, the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. On the rocky island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea, a man named John, exiled by Roman authorities for his faith, received visions that would become the most controversial, the most interpreted, and the most misunderstood book in the Bible. Patmos was a prison colony in the 1st century, a place where the Roman Empire sent those it considered dangerous, and John was there because he had refused to stop talking about Jesus. But in that isolation, surrounded by sea and stone, he saw the heavens open. He saw a door standing open in heaven, and a voice like a trumpet called him up to see what must take place. What John saw and wrote down in the book of Revelation was not a straightforward prediction of future events in the way modern readers often assume. It was apocalyptic literature, a genre that used vivid symbols, numbers, and cosmic imagery to communicate theological truths about the conflict between good and evil, the sovereignty of God, and the ultimate victory of Christ. But because the symbols are so powerful, and because John organized his vision around a sequence of judgments, generations of readers have treated Revelation like a coded news broadcast, trying to match its imagery to current events. The most famous image in Revelation comes in chapter 6, when the Lamb, who alone is worthy to open the scroll of God's judgment, begins to break the 7 seals. The first 4 seals release the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, a quartet of riders whose colors and missions have been analyzed, debated, and feared for nearly 2,000 years. The first rider appears on a white horse, holding a bow, and he is given a crown. He rides out as a conqueror bent on conquest. In some interpretations, this rider represents the spread of the gospel, a white horse symbolizing purity and victory. In others, he represents false messiahs or political powers that promise peace but deliver conquest. The second rider appears on a fiery red horse, and he is given power to take peace from the earth so that people would slaughter one another. This rider carries a great sword, and his mission is to unleash war on a scale that humanity cannot control. The third rider appears on a black horse, holding a pair of scales in his hand, and a voice announces that wheat and barley will be sold at famine prices, while oil and wine are not to be damaged. This rider represents famine and economic collapse, scarcity that drives desperation. The fourth rider appears on a pale horse, and his name is Death, with Hades following close behind. He is given authority over a quarter of the earth to kill by sword, famine, plague, and wild beasts. What is remarkable about the 4 horsemen is how universally they have been applied to every era of history. Every age has its conquests, its wars, its famines, and its plagues. The 1st century Christians saw the horsemen in the Roman conquest of Judea. Medieval Europeans saw them in the Crusades, the Black Death, and the famines that swept the continent. Modern readers see them in world wars, genocides, pandemics, and the constant drumbeat of conflict that fills the news cycle. The horsemen are not specific predictions of particular events. They are a symbolic framework for understanding the human condition, a theological argument that conquest, war, famine, and death are not random accidents, but are part of a story that God is bringing to a conclusion. They are judgments, but they are also warnings, opportunities for repentance that humanity repeatedly refuses to take. In the vision, after the horsemen ride, the martyrs cry out from under the altar, asking how long until God avenges their blood. They are told to wait a little longer until the full number of their fellow servants and brothers and sisters are killed as they had been. This is a sobering moment in the text, a reminder that the suffering of the faithful is not outside God's awareness, but it is also not immediately resolved. Beyond the horsemen, Revelation unfolds a cascade of judgments that build in intensity. The trumpets follow the seals, bringing further devastation on the earth, the sea, the rivers, and the heavenly bodies. Then come the bowls of wrath, the final and most intense judgments poured out on a world that has refused to repent. In between these judgment cycles, John sees visions of the beast rising from the sea, the false prophet, the mark of the beast, and the great prostitute Babylon. He sees the battle of Armageddon, the final confrontation between the forces of evil and the armies of heaven. And then he sees the new heaven and the new earth, the holy city Jerusalem coming down out of heaven, and the dwelling of God with humanity, where there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. This cosmic sweep from judgment to redemption, from chaos to new creation, is what gives Revelation its power. It is not simply a prediction of disasters. It is a story about how God redeems a broken world through judgment that clears away evil and a new creation that restores what was lost. The problem for modern readers is that we often focus so much on the disasters that we forget the ending, forgetting that in John's vision the last word is not wrath, but restoration. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Revelation is its use of numbers and symbols. 7 is the number of completeness, so the 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls represent the full and complete judgment of God. 12 represents the people of God, so the 12 tribes and 12 apostles appear throughout. 1,000 represents an immense but finite period. So the 1,000-year reign of Christ is not necessarily a literal 1,000 years, but a symbol of a complete and definitive period of peace. The beast with 7 heads and 10 horns draws on Daniel's visions, combining the empires of the past into a symbol of the anti-God power that opposes God's people in every age. The mark of the beast, which prevents buying or selling for those who do not receive it, has been applied to everything from imperial loyalty oaths in the Roman Empire to credit cards in the modern era. John was writing to first-century Christians facing persecution under Roman rule, and his original audience would have understood the beast as Rome, the mark as loyalty to the emperor cult, and the call to endurance as a direct challenge to their cultural moment. But because Revelation uses symbols that are not tied to a single historical referent, each generation has found ways to see its own oppressors and its own crises in the text. 593 BC to the present day. Who is the modern Gog and Magog? In the land of Babylon, by the banks of the Chebar River, the prophet Ezekiel received visions that were as strange and symbolic as anything in Revelation. Among the most haunting of these visions is the prophecy in Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39, a passage that has been the subject of more geopolitical speculation than almost any other in the Old Testament. Ezekiel sees a figure named Gog from the land of Magog, a prince or leader who will come from the far north with a vast coalition of nations to invade Israel in the latter days. God says that he will put hooks in Gog's jaws and bring him and his army against the mountains of Israel, where they will be defeated in such a spectacular way that it will take 7 months to bury the dead and 7 years to burn the weapons. This prophecy has been interpreted in wildly different ways across Jewish and Christian history, but in the modern era it has become one of the primary lenses through which end-times watchers view conflicts involving Russia, Iran, Turkey, and other nations in the northern Middle East. The names in Ezekiel's prophecy are ancient, and their modern identifications are matters of intense debate. Magog is often linked to the Scythians, a nomadic people from the steppes north of the Black Sea, a region that today includes parts of Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. Meshech and Tubal are usually identified with peoples in what is now Turkey. Persia is explicitly named in the text, and Persia is the ancient name for modern Iran. Kush and Put are usually understood as regions in Africa, possibly Sudan and Libya or Somalia. Gomer and Beth Togarmah are associated with peoples in Anatolia, again modern Turkey. When you map these ancient names onto a modern map, you get a coalition that stretches from Russia in the north through Turkey and Iran in the east and south, with various African nations included as well. For prophecy teachers in the 21st century, this looks remarkably like an alliance of Russia, Iran, Turkey, and various Arab and African states. A coalition that has indeed become more aligned in recent years through military cooperation, economic agreements, and shared opposition to Western influence in the region. The modern obsession with Gog and Magog as a Russia prophecy began in earnest during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was the great northern enemy of the West. Preachers and prophecy writers argued that Ezekiel's prediction of an invasion from the far north pointed directly to the Soviet Union, and they expected that invasion to come at any moment. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many of these interpreters had to scramble to adjust their theories. Some argued that Russia would eventually rise again, and indeed, under Vladimir Putin, Russia has reasserted itself as a major military power with significant influence in the Middle East. Others shifted their focus to Iran, arguing that Persia was the key player in the coalition and that Russia was merely a supporting actor. The flexibility of the interpretation is both its strength and its weakness. Because Ezekiel did not provide a detailed map with modern borders, each generation can map the ancient names onto its own geopolitical anxieties. For readers in the 1980s, the great northern threat was the USSR. For readers in the 2020s, it is Putin's Russia, allied with Iran and possibly Turkey, poised to strike at Israel. What makes the Gog and Magog prophecy so compelling to modern readers is that it seems to describe a war that has not yet happened, but that feels increasingly possible. Ezekiel says that Gog will come against Israel in the latter days, after Israel has been gathered from the nations and is living securely in its own land. For many interpreters, the modern state of Israel, established in 1948, is the fulfillment of that gathering. The current tensions between Israel and its neighbors, the war with Iran, the presence of Russian forces in Syria, the complex relationship between Turkey and Israel, all of these create a geopolitical landscape that feels like a stage being set for Ezekiel's predicted invasion. But there are significant problems with this identification that careful interpreters acknowledge. Ezekiel's invasion describes an army that comes from the north and attacks a peaceful and unsuspecting Israel, an Israel that is living in unwalled villages without bars or gates. That description does not match modern Israel, which is one of the most heavily militarized nations on earth, surrounded by walls, fences, and advanced defense systems. Moreover, the prophecy says that God will destroy Gog and his army in such a way that the nations will recognize God's sovereignty. Whether this describes a future war, or whether it was a prophecy fulfilled in ancient conflicts involving the Scythians or other northern peoples, is a question that divides scholars. The Gog and Magog prophecy also appears in Islamic end-times traditions, where it takes on a different character. In the Quran, Gog and Magog, known as Ya'juj and Ma'juj, are barbaric peoples who are held behind a great wall built by Dhul-Qarnayn, often identified with Alexander the Great. At the end of time, they will break through the wall and spread destruction across the earth before God destroys them. This version of the prophecy has its own modern geopolitical interpretations, with some Muslim prophecy teachers identifying the nations of the north, including Russia and China, as the modern Ya'juj and Ma'juj. The overlap between Jewish, Christian, and Islamic end-times traditions around this prophecy means that it has the potential to influence not just religious believers, but also political leaders and military planners who take these prophecies seriously. When the Iran-Israel war heats up, when Russian warships move through the eastern Mediterranean, when Turkish drones appear in conflict zones across the region, the language of Gog and Magog is never far from the surface, whispered in prophecy conferences, debated on social media, and sometimes even referenced by political figures who know that these ancient names carry modern weight. 95 AD, Armageddon, the last battlefield. There is a name so famous that it escaped the pages of Scripture and became a word in global vocabulary, a shorthand for the final cataclysmic battle that ends the world. Armageddon. The word appears only once in the Bible, in Revelation chapter 16, as the sixth bowl of wrath is poured out. John writes that the spirits of demons gather the kings of the whole world for the battle on the great day of God Almighty. Then he adds a geographical detail that has been debated for centuries. He says they gathered them to the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. The word is almost certainly a Greek transliteration of the Hebrew Har-Megiddo, which means Mount Megiddo. But Megiddo is not a mountain in the way we usually think of mountains. It is a tell, an ancient mound formed by the ruins of successive cities built on top of each other, rising about 60 feet above the surrounding plain. And yet this relatively modest elevation has become the symbolic center of the world's final war, the place where, according to popular end-times teaching, the armies of the Antichrist will gather to fight against the returning Christ. The strategic importance of Megiddo is undeniable. The site sits at the western edge of the Jezreel Valley, also known as the Valley of Megiddo, or the Plain of Esdraelon, one of the most fertile and strategically crucial pieces of land in the ancient world. For thousands of years, armies have marched through this valley because it controls the Via Maris, the ancient trade route that connected Egypt to Mesopotamia, Africa to Asia. Egyptians fought here, Canaanites fought here, Israelites under Deborah and Barak fought here against the Canaanite general Sisera. Josiah, the righteous king of Judah, died here in battle against the Egyptian pharaoh Necho. The British general Edmund Allenby defeated the Ottoman Turks here in 1917, a battle that proved decisive in the World War I campaign for Palestine. Megiddo has been a battlefield for so long and so consistently that it is almost as if the land itself was designed for war. When John of Patmos used the name Armageddon, he was drawing on this deep history, using Megiddo as a symbol of decisive military conflict, the place where the fate of nations has been determined again and again. But the geography of Armageddon is more complex than a single valley. The Jezreel Valley stretches from the Mediterranean coast near Haifa eastward to the Jordan Valley, a broad and fertile plain that is today divided between Israel and the Palestinian territories. The traditional identification of Armageddon with Megiddo has been challenged by some interpreters who point out that Megiddo is not a mountain and that the Hebrew phrase Har-Megiddo is unusual. Some scholars suggest that the original text might have been Hor-Megiddo, the mountain of Megiddo, but there is no mountain at Megiddo. Others propose that Armageddon refers not to Megiddo, but to the city of Zechariah's prophecy, a place associated with mourning and judgment. Still others argue that Armageddon is a symbolic name drawn from the history of Megiddo, but referring to the entire region of Israel as the final battlefield. The book of Revelation itself, in earlier chapters, describes the winepress of God's wrath being trodden outside the city, a reference that some interpreters connect to the Valley of Jehoshaphat near Jerusalem. The precise geography matters less than the symbolic meaning. Armageddon is the place where the forces of evil gather to make their final stand against God, and it is the place where they are decisively defeated. The modern popular understanding of Armageddon owes less to the actual text of Revelation than to a long tradition of interpretation that turned the single verse into a whole scenario. In this scenario, which is most fully developed in dispensationalist teaching, the Antichrist will establish his headquarters in Jerusalem after desecrating the rebuilt Third Temple. When he is threatened by a coalition of Eastern kings, he will gather the armies of the world at Megiddo for the final battle. But then Jesus will return, descending from heaven with his armies of angels and saints, and will defeat the Antichrist and his forces in a battle so decisive that the blood flows as high as a horse's bridle for a distance of about 180 miles. This interpretation, which has been popularized in books like Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth and the Left Behind series, has become so dominant in popular culture that many people assume it is what the Bible actually says. But the text of Revelation does not describe a battle at Armageddon. It describes a gathering of kings at Armageddon, and then the final battle itself is described later as taking place at the winepress of God's wrath, which is not explicitly identified with Megiddo. The popular scenario is a synthesis of several biblical passages woven together by interpreters who were trying to create a coherent narrative. What makes Armageddon such a powerful symbol is that it taps into something deep in human psychology. We want the chaos of history to have a point. We want the conflicts that tear the world apart to lead to a final resolution. The idea that all the wars of history are moving toward one final war, a war so decisive that it ends all wars, is comforting in a strange way. It gives meaning to suffering. It provides a narrative structure to what often feels like random violence. And because the Jezreel Valley is a real place where real battles have been fought for 3,000 years, Armageddon feels grounded in history even as it points toward the future. For believers who take the prophecy seriously, the signs of Armageddon are all around them. The Iran-Israel war, the Hezbollah-Lebanon war, the Gaza war, these are not just regional conflicts. They are pieces of a larger puzzle. Preliminary skirmishes in the valley that will one day host the final battle. And when the headlines speak of missiles over the Jezreel Valley, of drones above Megiddo, of ground incursions into the northern Galilee, the word Armageddon is never far from the minds of those who have been taught to watch that valley for signs of the end. 1830 AD. Who created the Rapture? The story of John Nelson Darby. One Sunday morning in the early 1800s, an Irish priest stood in the pulpit of a Church of Ireland parish and delivered a sermon that he believed would change everything. His name was John Nelson Darby, and he was about to walk away from everything he had known. Darby had been ordained as a deacon in the Church of Ireland in 1825 and as a priest in 1826. He was brilliant, charismatic, and deeply committed to his faith. But a riding accident that nearly killed him had shaken his confidence in the established church, and a growing disillusionment with what he saw as dead formalism led him to a radical conclusion. The established churches, including his own, had become corrupt. They had lost the true faith. The only way forward was to leave them behind and gather with other believers in simple assemblies that met around the Bible alone. This decision led Darby to become one of the founders of the Plymouth Brethren, a movement that would have an outsized influence on the development of modern end-times theology. But Darby's most lasting contribution was not the Brethren movement itself. It was a system of biblical interpretation called dispensationalism, and within that system, a doctrine that would become one of the most recognizable and controversial ideas in evangelical Christianity. The Rapture. The idea that believers would be taken up from the earth before a time of tribulation was not entirely new when Darby began teaching it. A few earlier writers, including a 17th-century Puritan named Increase Mather, had speculated about a two-stage return of Christ, one to catch away the saints and one to judge the earth. But Darby systematized the idea, wove it into a comprehensive framework for understanding all of history, and promoted it with such energy and persuasion that it spread from his small meetings in Ireland and England across the Atlantic to the United States, where it would take root and grow beyond anything he could have imagined. Darby's dispensationalism divided history into distinct periods or dispensations, each representing a different way that God dealt with humanity. In each dispensation, humanity failed the test, and God judged them before moving to the next dispensation. The final dispensation, the dispensation of grace, would end with the rapture of the church, a 7-year period of tribulation, the return of Christ to establish a 1,000-year reign, and finally, the new heavens and new earth. This system gave believers a detailed map of the future, a sense that they could know where they stood in God's timeline, and a reason to watch current events with intense interest. Darby traveled to the United States multiple times between 1859 and 1874, and his preaching found a receptive audience in a country that was already fascinated with prophecy. America in the 19th century was a hotbed of prophetic speculation. William Miller had led the Millerite movement, which predicted that Christ would return in 1844. When that prediction failed, many of his followers were disillusioned, but others were hungry for a more sophisticated system that could explain why their hopes had been disappointed. Darby offered that system. He argued that prophecy was not for the church but for Israel, that the church was a mystery, hidden in the Old Testament and revealed only in the New, and that the church's role was not to interpret the signs of the times, but to wait for the rapture that would remove them before the tribulation began. This made sense of the failed predictions. The Millerites had been wrong about the date, but Darby's system suggested that even if they had been right, they would have been removed before the judgment anyway. It was a theological framework that made uncertainty manageable, that gave believers a way to watch the world without being caught in the disasters they expected to come. The turning point for Darby's ideas was the Niagara Bible Conference, a series of annual meetings that began in 1878 and brought together prominent prophecy teachers from across the United States. These conferences were the incubators of what became known as premillennial dispensationalism, and they produced a generation of pastors, writers, and evangelists who took Darby's system back to their churches and spread it through the emerging network of Bible institutes and prophecy conferences. One of the most important figures in this network was C.I. Scofield, an American lawyer turned pastor who compiled the Scofield Reference Bible, first published in 1909. The Scofield Bible was a study Bible that embedded dispensationalist notes directly into the text, so that readers could not read the Bible without also reading Darby's interpretation. It became enormously popular, selling millions of copies and shaping the theology of generations of American evangelicals. By the early 20th century, what had started as a niche teaching in a small Irish movement had become a dominant framework for understanding the Bible in large portions of American Christianity. The Rapture entered American popular culture in a major way in the 1970s with the publication of Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth. Lindsey was not a theologian. He was a campus minister who had studied at Dallas Theological Seminary, one of the flagship institutions of dispensationalism. His book, which argued that current events were lining up with biblical prophecy to point toward an imminent rapture, became the best-selling non-fiction book of the decade, selling over 28 million copies by 1990. It was followed by a film version narrated by Orson Welles, and it established a template that would be repeated again and again. A prophecy teacher looks at the headlines, finds ways to connect them to biblical passages, announces that the signs are converging, and warns that time is running out. The pattern was repeated in the 1980s with books about the Soviet Union as Gog and Magog, in the 1990s with speculation about the European Union as the revived Roman Empire, and in the early 2000s with the Left Behind series, which sold over 80 million copies and was adapted into a series of films starring Kirk Cameron. Each wave of prophecy publishing has followed the same formula, and each wave has been more profitable than the last. What began with Darby's meetings in a Dublin living room became a multi-billion-dollar industry that continues to shape how millions of people understand the news. The Third Temple and the Red Heifers, why they matter for prophecy. In a field in central Israel, behind a high-security fence and under constant guard, a small herd of red cattle graze as if they were ordinary livestock. But these are not ordinary cattle. They are red heifers, a breed of cow that must meet a precise set of criteria laid out in the Book of Numbers, chapter 19. They must be red, entirely red, with no more than 2 hairs of any other color. They must never have been yoked or used for labor, and they must be sacrificed and burned outside the camp, their ashes mixed with water to create a purification ritual that, according to Jewish law, is required for entering the temple area. The red heifers currently in Israel were born in Texas, raised under the supervision of the Temple Institute, a controversial organization based in the Jewish quarter of the Old City of Jerusalem that is dedicated to preparing for the rebuilding of the Third Temple. The Institute has been working for decades to recreate the vessels, the garments, the musical instruments, and the architectural plans necessary for temple worship. The red heifers are the final piece, the one element without which the temple cannot be consecrated and the priesthood cannot be purified. For those who believe that the temple must be rebuilt before the end times can unfold, the presence of red heifers in Israel is the most significant prophetic development since the Six-Day War. The idea of rebuilding the temple on the Temple Mount is one of the most explosive issues in the world. The Temple Mount is sacred to three religions. For Jews, it is the site of the first and second temples, the holiest place on earth where God's presence dwelt among his people. For Muslims, it is the Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, containing the Dome of the Rock, where Muhammad is believed to have ascended to heaven, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam. For Christians, it is the place where Jesus taught, where he drove out the money changers, and where he predicted the destruction of the temple. Any attempt to change the status quo on the Temple Mount, to build a Jewish temple alongside or in place of the Islamic structures, would be met with immediate and violent resistance from Muslims around the world. The Israeli government, since the Six-Day War, has maintained the status quo that Moshe Dayan established, allowing the Islamic Waqf to administer the site while Israeli security forces control access and prevent Jewish prayer on the mount itself. But the status quo is fragile. There have been repeated clashes over the years, sparked by everything from metal detectors to police raids to unauthorized visits by Jewish activists. And the Temple Institute, while officially outside the Israeli government, has been preparing for the moment when the political situation shifts enough to allow construction to begin. The red heifer ritual is central to the temple project because, according to Numbers 19, anyone who comes into contact with death, which includes virtually everyone living outside the temple's purity system, must be purified with the ashes of the red heifer before they can enter the temple precincts. Without the red heifer, no one can be purified, and without purification, the temple cannot function. So the existence of red heifers that meet the biblical criteria is, for temple advocates, proof that God is preparing the way for the temple's reconstruction. The Temple Institute has been searching for red heifers for decades, and previous attempts have failed because the heifers developed imperfections or were not certified as kosher. The current herd, which arrived in Israel in 2022, has been carefully monitored and protected, and Temple Institute officials have announced that at least one of the heifers has been certified as meeting all the requirements. The question of when and if the heifer will be sacrificed is a matter of intense speculation. Some temple advocates want to proceed as quickly as possible, while others argue that the political situation is not yet ready and that moving too quickly could spark a war. For Christians who follow end times prophecy, the red heifers are one of the most exciting developments in decades. In the popular prophecy narrative, the third temple is the place where the Antichrist will desecrate the Holy of Holies, declaring himself to be God and triggering the final tribulation. Without the temple, there is no place for the abomination of desolation. Without the red heifer, there is no temple. So the presence of red heifers that can be used for purification is seen as a necessary precondition for the end times to begin. Prophecy teachers have been tracking the red heifers with the same intensity that sports fans track their favorite teams, analyzing every development, every photograph, every statement from Temple Institute officials. When the heifers arrived in Israel, it was front-page news in the prophecy world, generating thousands of videos, articles, and social media posts. When one of the heifers was found to have a disqualifying mark, there was a collective sigh of disappointment. When a new heifer was certified, the excitement returned. The red heifers have become a kind of prophecy weather vane, a sign that the conditions are right for the next stage of the end times narrative. The red heifer controversy also highlights the deep divisions between different groups who are watching the same events. For secular Israelis, the Temple Institute is a fringe organization whose activities are more likely to provoke violence than to bring redemption. For religious Jews, the Temple Institute represents the fulfillment of ancient prophecies. But even among religious Jews, there is deep disagreement about whether the temple should be rebuilt now or only after the Messiah comes. For Muslims, the red heifers are not just a theological curiosity, but a direct threat to the status quo of the Haram al-Sharif, a sign that Jewish extremists are preparing to destroy the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. For Christians, the red heifers are either a thrilling prophetic sign or an example of misplaced focus on physical structures rather than spiritual realities. And for the international community, the red heifers are a potential flashpoint, a small spark that could ignite a fire that would consume the entire region. In March of 2026, with tensions already high across the Middle East, the red heifers are a reminder that prophecy is not just about ancient texts. It is about land, about sovereignty, about the most sacred spaces on earth, and about what happens when ancient hopes meet modern realities. Who is the Antichrist? In the summer of 64 after Christ, a fire broke out in the Circus Maximus, a chariot racing stadium in the heart of Rome. The flames spread quickly through the narrow streets and wooden tenements of the city, and when the fire died 6 days later, 10 of Rome's 14 districts lay in ruins. Rumors spread that the Emperor Nero himself had started the fire to clear land for his grand new palace, the Domus Aurea, and to distract from his increasingly erratic behavior. Needing a scapegoat, Nero chose the Christians, a small and misunderstood sect that had already gained a reputation for secrecy and disloyalty to the Roman gods. The persecution that followed was savage. Christians were wrapped in animal skins and torn apart by dogs. They were crucified. They were burned alive as human torches to light Nero's gardens at night. It was in this atmosphere of terror that the book of Revelation was written, and for its first readers, the beast whose number was 666 was almost certainly Nero, the emperor who had turned his power against the innocent and who many believed would return from the dead to terrorize the empire again. Nero was the first great Antichrist figure, but he was far from the last. Every era since has produced its own candidate, a ruler whose ambition, cruelty, and opposition to faith have seemed to fit the pattern laid out in Scripture. The idea of the Antichrist as a single individual who will arise at the end of history to oppose Christ and deceive the nations is not as clearly defined in the Bible as many modern readers assume. The term Antichrist appears only in the letters of John, where it refers to anyone who denies that Jesus is the Christ, and John says that many such antichrists have already appeared. The beast of Revelation, the man of lawlessness described by Paul in 2 Thessalonians, and the little horn of Daniel are all woven together in later Christian tradition to create a composite figure, a final world ruler who will embody evil, perform counterfeit miracles, demand worship, and ultimately be destroyed by the return of Christ. But the specifics of who this figure would be, where he would come from, and how he would arise have been filled in by each generation according to its own fears and political realities. For the early church, the Antichrist was Nero returned, or a future Roman emperor who would revive the persecution. For medieval Christians, the Antichrist was often identified with the Muslim leaders who threatened Christendom, or with individual popes who were seen as corrupt. The Reformation intensified this identification, with Protestant leaders declaring that the Pope was the Antichrist, and Catholic leaders returning the accusation by pointing to figures like Martin Luther. As the modern era unfolded, the list of Antichrist candidates grew longer and more diverse. Napoleon Bonaparte was a favorite target in the early 19th century. His ambition to conquer Europe, his coronation as emperor in the presence of the Pope, his military campaigns that destabilized the continent, all of this seemed to fit the pattern of the little horn that would uproot 3 kings and speak boastful things. Prophecy books of the era were filled with elaborate calculations linking Napoleon to the number 666, and when he was finally defeated at Waterloo, many breathed a sigh of relief that the Antichrist had been vanquished before he could do his worst. But new candidates quickly emerged. Adolf Hitler was perhaps the most widely recognized Antichrist candidate of the 20th century. His rise to power in Germany, his oratorical skill that mesmerized millions, his systematic persecution of Jews and Christians, his ambition for world domination, and his ultimate destruction all seemed to fit the pattern. Books published during and after World War II argued that Hitler was the Antichrist, that his Third Reich was the final kingdom, and that his defeat at the hands of the Allies was the Battle of Armageddon. When the war ended and the world did not end with it, the search for a new candidate began again. Joseph Stalin was another frequent candidate, particularly among Christians in the West who saw Soviet communism as the ultimate anti-God system. Stalin's brutality, his state-sponsored atheism, his control over a vast empire that spanned 11 time zones, all of this made him a plausible figure for the Antichrist role. Prophecy teachers in the 1950s and 60s often identified the Soviet Union as the northern power of Ezekiel's prophecy, and Stalin or his successors as the final world ruler. The Cold War provided a rich backdrop for Antichrist speculation, with the United States and the Soviet Union cast as the forces of good and evil in a global struggle that seemed destined to end in nuclear Armageddon. But Stalin died, the Cold War ended, and the Antichrist remained a figure of the future rather than a figure of the past. Each generation's certainty that they had identified the final Antichrist has been followed by disappointment and a renewed search for the next candidate. In the 21st century, the search for the Antichrist has expanded to include a wider range of candidates. Some prophecy teachers look to the European Union, arguing that the 10 horns of Daniel's fourth beast correspond to 10 European nations that will eventually unite under a single leader, a revived Roman Empire that will be the final world power. Others look to the United Nations, seeing in the push for global governance the shadow of a one-world government that the Antichrist will lead. Still others point to individual leaders, from Vladimir Putin to various European politicians, who seem to embody the combination of political power, personal charisma, and willingness to challenge traditional values that prophecy teachers associate with the Antichrist. The rise of artificial intelligence and digital identity systems has added a new dimension to the search, with some suggesting that the Antichrist will be an AI system rather than a human leader, a technological beast that controls the global economy through the mark of the beast. What unites all these candidates across the centuries is the human tendency to project our deepest fears onto the most threatening figure of our own time. Nero was terrifying to first-century Christians. Hitler was terrifying to 20th-century Christians. The leaders who dominate the headlines in 2026 are terrifying to Christians today. The Antichrist is always the monster under the bed, the face we see in the shadows, the ruler whose power seems to be growing while the forces of good seem to be retreating. Islamic End Times Prophecies. In the year 622, a merchant from Mecca named Muhammad fled persecution in his hometown and established a new community in the city of Yathrib, later renamed Medina. That migration, known as the Hijra, marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar, and it was in Medina that Muhammad's revelations, which would become the Quran, took on a new dimension. Among those revelations were prophecies about the end of the world, prophecies that have shaped Islamic thought for 14 centuries and that continue to influence politics, culture, and conflict across the Middle East and beyond. Islamic end times beliefs are not identical to Christian end times beliefs, but they share enough common elements: a final battle, a messianic figure, a false messiah, a period of tribulation, that the two traditions have often intersected in ways that are both fascinating and deeply consequential. For anyone trying to understand the modern landscape of prophecy and conflict, understanding Islamic eschatology is not optional. It is essential. At the center of Islamic end times teaching is the figure of the Mahdi, which means the guided one. The Mahdi is a future leader from the lineage of the Prophet Muhammad who will appear at the end of time to restore justice, fill the earth with righteousness, and lead the Muslim community to victory over its enemies. The Mahdi is mentioned in numerous hadith collections, the sayings and actions of Muhammad that serve as a secondary source of Islamic law and theology, and belief in the Mahdi is held by both Sunni and Shia Muslims, though with significant differences. For Sunni Muslims, the Mahdi is a future figure who has not yet appeared, a righteous leader who will emerge in a time of great turmoil and unite the Muslim world. For Shia Muslims, particularly the Twelver branch that is dominant in Iran, the Mahdi is not a future figure, but a figure from the past. He is Muhammad al-Mahdi, the 12th Imam, who disappeared in the year 941 and who is believed to be in occultation, hidden by God, until the time when he will return to establish justice. This belief in the return of the 12th Imam is central to the political and religious identity of the Islamic Republic of Iran, where the revolution of 1979 was framed as a preparation for the Mahdi's return, and where political leaders have often spoken of their role as stewards until the Imam's reappearance. Opposite the Mahdi in Islamic eschatology stands al-Dajjal, the false Messiah, a figure who shares many characteristics with the Antichrist of Christian tradition. Al-Dajjal is described in the Hadith as a one-eyed man who will appear at the end of time, perform miracles that deceive many, and claim to be God. He will travel the earth, leaving destruction in his wake, and only true believers will be able to resist his deception. According to Islamic prophecy, al-Dajjal will be defeated by Isa, the Islamic name for Jesus, who will return to earth not as a divine figure, but as a prophet and a follower of Muhammad. Isa will descend to earth in Damascus, will pursue al-Dajjal, and will kill him at the gate of Lud, a city in modern-day Israel. After defeating al-Dajjal, Isa will rule justly, break the cross, kill the pig, and establish a period of peace and righteousness that will last for 40 years before the final judgment. This return of Jesus is one of the most distinctive features of Islamic eschatology, and it creates a fascinating parallel and point of tension with Christian end-times beliefs. For Christians, Jesus returns as the victorious king and judge. For Muslims, Jesus returns as a follower of Muhammad who confirms Islamic teachings. The two traditions cannot both be correct, but they both place Jerusalem, Damascus, and the land of Israel at the center of the final events. The geography of Islamic end times is also significant. The final battles are prophesied to take place in the region of Greater Syria, which includes modern Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. Damascus is the city where Isa will descend. The Mahdi will arise in Mecca or Medina. Constantinople, modern Istanbul, will be conquered by Muslim forces led by the Mahdi. Rome will also be conquered, and the forces of the Dajjal will gather in the land of Israel before their final defeat. This geographical focus means that the conflicts in the Middle East are not just political or strategic for many Muslims. They are the fulfillment of prophecy, the signs that the Mahdi is about to appear, that al-Dajjal is about to emerge, that the end of history is approaching. The Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s was interpreted by some Shia clerics as a sign of the Mahdi's imminent return. The Gulf War of 1991, the Iraq War of 2003, the Arab Spring, the rise of ISIS, and the ongoing conflicts in Syria, Yemen, and Israel have all been filtered through this prophetic lens. For those who hold these beliefs, the chaos of the Middle East is not a problem to be solved. It is a prelude to the final solution, a necessary breakdown before the arrival of the guided one. The overlap between Christian and Islamic end-times beliefs has created some strange alliances and some even stranger conflicts. Some Christian prophecy teachers have argued that Islam itself is the Antichrist system, that the Mahdi is the false prophet, and that the return of Isa in Islamic prophecy is a counterfeit of the true return of Christ. Others have argued that the two traditions are pointing toward the same events from different angles, that the Mahdi and the Antichrist are the same figure, and that the final battle will be a cosmic confrontation between good and evil that transcends religious boundaries. On the ground in the Middle East, the interplay of these prophecies has real consequences. When the Iranian government speaks of preparing for the return of the 12th Imam, it is not merely speaking metaphorically. The military strategy, the political alliances, and the foreign policy of the Islamic Republic are shaped in part by the belief that the Mahdi could return at any moment and that Iran must be ready to serve as his vanguard. When Sunni militant groups like ISIS declared the establishment of a caliphate in 2014, they did so in the language of prophecy, arguing that the time of the Mahdi had come and that their territory was the seed of the coming Islamic State. And when Israeli leaders speak of the existential threats facing their country, They are not just talking about nuclear weapons and conventional military threats. They are talking about a region saturated with prophecy, a region where millions of people believe that the final battles of history are about to be fought on the land where they live. Nostradamus and World War III, what his prophecies actually say. In the year 1555, a French astrologer and physician named Michel de Nostradamus published a book that would make him one of the most famous and controversial figures in European history. The book was titled Les Prophecies, and it consisted of nearly 1,000 poetic quatrains, 4-line verses arranged in groups of 100 called centuries. Nostradamus claimed that his prophecies were divinely inspired, though he was careful to couch them in deliberately obscure language, mixing French, Latin, Greek, and Italian words, using mythological references, anagrams, and symbolic imagery that made the verses nearly impossible to interpret with certainty. This obscurity was intentional. Nostradamus lived in an age when predicting the future could get you burned at the stake, and he was protecting himself from accusations of sorcery or heresy. But the obscurity also guaranteed his longevity. Because the quatrains were vague enough to fit many different events, each generation has been able to rediscover Nostradamus, find its own crises in his verses, and declare that he predicted the wars, the leaders, and the disasters of its own time. The pattern of Nostradamus' interpretation is remarkably consistent. A crisis erupts, a war breaks out, a leader rises to power, and almost immediately someone finds a quatrain that seems to describe the event. During the French Revolution, interpreters found quatrains predicting the rise of Napoleon. During World War II, they found quatrains predicting the rise of Hitler, whose name they claimed appeared in Nostradamus' verses. During the Cold War, they found quatrains predicting nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. After September 11, 2001, they found quatrains predicting the attack on New York. And in the 2026 environment of multiple regional wars, renewed Russian aggression, tensions with Iran, and fears of a global conflict, the Nostradamus industry is booming again. Videos with titles like Nostradamus predicted World War III in 2026 and The Final War, What Nostradamus Saw, are generating millions of views, and the quatrains are being passed and repassed for any clue about what comes next. The most famous Nostradamus quatrain for those who follow his predictions about World War is usually cited as Century 2, Quatrain 24, which reads in translation, "Beasts ferocious from hunger will swim across rivers, the greater part of the battlefield will be against Hister. In a cage of iron the great one will be drawn, when the child of Germany observes nothing." The word Hister was interpreted by some as a reference to Hitler, and this quatrain was widely circulated during World War II as proof that Nostradamus had predicted the rise of the Nazi dictator. But Hister was also a name for the Danube River in ancient times, and the quatrain could just as easily be interpreted as a reference to a military campaign along the Danube. This ambiguity is the key to Nostradamus' enduring appeal. The quatrains are like inkblot tests. People see in them what they are already looking for. If you are looking for a prediction of World War III, you will find it. If you are looking for a prediction of peace, you will find that too. Nostradamus' predictions about the Middle East are particularly popular in the current climate. There are quatrains about the fall of Jerusalem, about wars involving Persia, about conflicts in the Eastern Mediterranean, about the rise of a great leader from the East. Interpreters have woven these verses into narratives about the Iran-Israel war, about the war in Gaza, about the possibility of a wider conflict that draws in Turkey, Egypt, and the Gulf states. Some have linked his quatrains to the Euphrates River drying up, claiming that he foresaw the environmental catastrophe that is now unfolding in Iraq and Syria. Others have connected his verses to the Strait of Hormuz, the flashpoint for any Iran war, arguing that he predicted a naval conflict that would disrupt global oil supplies. The more vague the original verses, the more specific the modern interpretations become. And because Nostradamus wrote in a style that was deliberately confusing, there is almost no claim that cannot be supported by some creative reading. The problem with Nostradamus' predictions, as any serious scholar will tell you, is that they are not predictions at all in the way that modern readers understand the term. Nostradamus was writing in the tradition of medieval prophecy, which was more about moral warning and political commentary than about precise forecasting. His quatrains were often commentaries on the events of his own time, disguised as predictions of the future to avoid censorship and persecution. The famous quatrain about Hysteria, for example, was almost certainly a reference to the Habsburg dynasty and the wars of religion that were tearing Europe apart in the 16th century. But because the language is so obscure, it is easy to strip the quatrains of their historical context and read them as predictions of 20th and 21st century events. This process of retrofitting, taking an old text and making it seem to predict recent events, is a well-documented psychological phenomenon. It is the same process that leads people to find hidden codes in the Bible, to see the face of Jesus in a grilled cheese sandwich, and to believe that ancient prophecies were written with their own lifetime in mind. What makes Nostradamus relevant to a documentary about end times and World War III is not that his predictions are accurate. What makes him relevant is that millions of people believe they are accurate, and those beliefs shape how they interpret current events. When someone watches a YouTube video claiming that Nostradamus predicted the war in Ukraine, the conflict with Iran, and the coming of a world war, they are more likely to see those events as part of a predetermined pattern rather than as contingent historical events that could have been avoided. They are more likely to feel that war is inevitable, that diplomacy is futile, and that the only sensible response is to prepare for the worst. This sense of inevitability can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If enough people believe that World War III is coming, they may act in ways that make it more likely. If enough people believe that a leader is the Antichrist, they may resist him in ways that escalate conflict. Nostradamus did not predict the future, but the belief that he predicted the future has real consequences in the present, and those consequences are part of the story of how we got to where we are in March of 2026. For a much deeper exploration of Nostradamus, his original writings, and how modern interpreters have twisted his words, be sure to watch our full Nostradamus documentary, where we go into much greater detail about his prophecies, linked in the description below. Russia-Ukraine War. Is this the Gog and Magog prophecy? In the frozen fields of eastern Ukraine, where the snows of March have begun to thaw into mud that will soon become the black glue of the spring Rasputitsa, the war that began more than 4 years ago grinds on with a renewed intensity that has caught the attention of the world. Russian forces have pushed again toward the city of Sloviansk, following the same axis of advance that failed in the early days of the invasion in 2022. Ukrainian defenders, supplied with Western weapons and fighting on familiar ground, have slowed the advance but not stopped it. The front lines shift by meters rather than kilometers, but the casualties mount in numbers that are too terrible to contemplate. For the people living in the towns and villages of Donbass, the war is not a headline or a YouTube video. It is the sound of artillery that wakes them at night, the smell of smoke from burning buildings, the faces of neighbors who have been killed or have fled and may never return. But for millions of prophecy watchers around the world, the war in Ukraine is not primarily a humanitarian catastrophe. It is a sign, a piece of a larger puzzle, a fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecy about Gog from the land of Magog coming from the far north to invade the land of Israel. The connection between Russia and Gog and Magog has become one of the most common themes in modern prophecy teaching. The argument goes like this. Ezekiel describes an invasion of Israel by a coalition led by Gog from the land of Magog, a people from the far north. The only major power directly north of Israel is Russia, which stretches from the Black Sea to the Arctic. The ancient names Meshech and Tubal are identified with Moscow and Tobolsk, cities in Russia. Persia is modern Iran, which is allied with Russia. The other nations mentioned, Gomer and Beth Togarmah, are identified with Turkey and the Caucasus region. Therefore, the coalition that Ezekiel describes is essentially Russia, Iran, Turkey, and various African and Central Asian nations. When Russia invades Ukraine in 2022 and again in 2026, prophecy teachers see this not as a conflict about NATO expansion, about energy politics, about the sovereignty of a former Soviet republic, but as the first stage of a wider war that will eventually draw Russia into the Middle East and trigger the invasion of Israel. They point to Russian military bases in Syria, to Russian cooperation with Iran, to Russian arms sales to Turkey, as evidence that the alliance is forming exactly as Ezekiel predicted. But the Ukraine-Russia war complicates this identification in ways that prophecy teachers rarely address. If Russia is Gog, the northern invader who will attack Israel in the latter days, why is Russia spending its military resources on a grinding war in Ukraine rather than preparing to attack Israel? Why is Russia, far from being the powerful invader that sweeps down from the north, bogged down in a war of attrition that has cost it hundreds of thousands of casualties and drained its economy? Why are the allies that prophecy teachers say will join Russia in attacking Israel, Iran and Turkey not fighting alongside Russia in Ukraine? Iran is supplying Russia with drones and missiles, but it is not committing its own forces. Turkey, a NATO member, has been supplying Ukraine with drones and has positioned itself as a mediator rather than a combatant. The coalition that exists on the ground in 2026 looks very different from the coalition that prophecy teachers have been predicting for decades. This gap between prophecy and reality has led some interpreters to adjust their timelines. Perhaps the Ukraine war is not the Gog and Magog war itself, but the preparation for it, the distraction that will weaken Russia before the real war begins. Perhaps the Gog and Magog war will come after the Ukraine war ends, when Russia has rebuilt its military and turned its attention south. Perhaps the identification of Russia with Gog is wrong, and the real northern invader is a different power altogether. The caution that must be applied to any identification of modern nations with biblical names is that this is not a neutral exercise. It is an interpretation, and like all interpretations, it is shaped by the interpreter's assumptions, biases, and cultural context. The identification of Russia with Gog became popular during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was the great enemy of the West, and it persisted after the Cold War because the interpretive framework had become deeply embedded in prophecy teaching. But there are other ways to read Ezekiel's prophecy. Some scholars argue that Gog and Magog are not specific nations, but symbolic names for the forces of chaos and evil that oppose God's people in every age. Others argue that the prophecy was fulfilled in ancient history, perhaps in the wars between the Scythians and the kingdoms of the Near East. Still others argue that the prophecy refers to a future war that will involve nations from the far north, but that identifying those nations with modern Russia is speculative at best. The text of Ezekiel does not say Russia, it says Rosh, which some translations render as chief or leader, not as a proper name. The identification of Meshech with Moscow and Tubal with Tobolsk is based on a superficial similarity of sound that does not hold up to linguistic scrutiny. The case for Russia as Gog is built on a foundation of assumptions that prophecy teachers present as facts. What is undeniable, regardless of how one interprets Ezekiel, is that the war in Ukraine has become a major focus of prophecy speculation in 2026. Every Russian advance, every Ukrainian counterattack, every statement from Putin about Russian interest in the region is filtered through the Gog and Magog lens. Prophecy channels on YouTube post daily updates analyzing the war in terms of biblical prophecy, and millions of viewers consume this content with the same intensity that others follow sports scores or stock market tickers. The human cost of the war, the hundreds of thousands dead, the millions displaced, the cities reduced to rubble, becomes secondary to the prophetic narrative. The people of Ukraine become pawns in a cosmic drama, their suffering a sign rather than a tragedy. This is the ethical danger that runs through all prophecy interpretation, the temptation to treat real people as symbols, to reduce their pain to a data point in a prophetic timeline. The war in Ukraine is real. The people dying in it are real. And any responsible discussion of prophecy must hold these two realities together, acknowledging that the prophetic interpretations exist, that they shape how millions of people understand the war, but also that the war is first and foremost a human disaster, not a prophetic sign. Could the Iran-Israel war trigger World War III? In the narrow waters of the Strait of Hormuz, a channel so tight that ships passing through it can see the coastlines of Iran on one side and Oman on the other, a confrontation has been building for years that many fear will be the spark that ignites a regional war and possibly a global one. The strait is the most important choke point in the global oil trade. Through it passes nearly 20% of the world's petroleum. Tankers carrying crude oil from the Gulf states to markets in Asia, Europe, and the Americas. If the strait were closed, even for a few days, the global economy would shudder. If it were closed for weeks, the effects would be catastrophic. Iran, which sits on the northern shore of the strait, has long threatened to close it in response to any attack on its nuclear facilities or its territory. The United States and Israel have repeatedly warned that they will not allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons, and the combination of these threats has created a powder keg that could explode at any moment. In March of 2026, with tensions already high from the war in Gaza, the conflict with Hezbollah, and the ongoing shadow war between Israel and Iran, the Strait of Hormuz is the place where many analysts believe the next war will begin. The Iran-Israel war that prophecy teachers have been predicting for decades is no longer a hypothetical. In recent years, Israel has conducted numerous covert operations inside Iran, assassinating nuclear scientists, sabotaging centrifuges, and launching cyber attacks that have set back Iran's nuclear program. Iran has responded with drone and missile attacks on Israeli ships, on Israeli diplomatic facilities, and on Israeli allies in the region. The two nations are already at war, though they have not yet crossed the threshold into full-scale conventional conflict. The question in 2026 is whether that threshold will be crossed, and if so, whether the conflict will remain contained or will spiral into a wider war that draws in the United States, the Gulf states, Turkey, and others. For prophecy watchers, this conflict is one of the most exciting developments in decades. Iran is Persia, one of the nations named in Ezekiel's Gog and Magog prophecy. The Strait of Hormuz is the gateway to the Gulf, the region where many interpreters believe the armies of the East will gather. And Israel, the target of the invasion, is at the center of the prophetic stage. The language of prophecy has seeped into the political discourse around the Iran-Israel conflict in ways that are sometimes explicit and sometimes implicit. Iranian leaders have often spoken of the return of the Mahdi and of the need to prepare the way for his coming by confronting Israel. The phrase "death to Israel" is not just a slogan. It is a religious commitment for those who believe that the destruction of Israel is a necessary precondition for the end times. Israeli leaders, for their part, have often framed their existential struggle in biblical terms, invoking the story of Esther, the story of David and Goliath, and the prophecies of return and redemption. When Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the United States Congress in 2015 to oppose the Iran nuclear deal, he framed the issue as a choice between a nuclear Iran and the survival of the Jewish state, a framing that resonated deeply with the prophecy, believing Christians who are a crucial part of his political support base in the United States. The Iran-Israel conflict is not just a geopolitical rivalry. It is a clash of prophetic worldviews, and that makes it more volatile, more resistant to diplomatic solutions, and more likely to escalate into war. The Strait of Hormuz itself has become a symbol in prophecy teaching. Some interpreters connect it to the Euphrates River, which in Revelation is dried up to prepare the way for the kings of the East. They argue that the drying of the Euphrates, which is happening in Iraq and Syria, will be followed by the closure of the strait, which will trigger a global economic collapse and a war that draws in all the nations of the earth. Others see the strait as the place where the Antichrist will rise, a figure who will control the world's energy supplies and use that control to dominate the global economy. Still others argue that the strait is the location of the final battle, that the kings of the East will cross the Euphrates, move through Iran, and confront the Antichrist at the strait, before moving on to Armageddon. These interpretations have no basis in the text of the Bible, which never mentions the Strait of Hormuz, but they are widely circulated in prophecy circles, and they shape how millions of people understand the conflict. The reality of the Iran-Israel conflict, stripped of prophecy language, is terrifying enough. Iran is moving closer to nuclear weapons capability, and Israeli leaders have made clear that they will not allow that to happen. A preemptive Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities would almost certainly trigger a massive Iranian retaliation, including missile attacks on Israel from Iran itself and from Hezbollah in Lebanon, which has an arsenal of over 100,000 rockets and missiles. The United States would likely be drawn in, both to defend Israel and to protect its own assets in the region. The Gulf states, which fear Iran's regional ambitions, might allow the United States to use their territory for operations against Iran. The Strait of Hormuz would become a war zone, with Iranian mines, fast attack boats, and anti-ship missiles targeting oil tankers and naval vessels. Global oil prices would spike, causing economic turmoil in countries around the world. The war could spread to Iraq, to Syria, to Yemen, and to other countries where Iran has proxies. And at the center of it all would be the ancient conflict that has defined the Middle East for generations. The conflict between Israel and its neighbors, now intensified by nuclear brinkmanship, by prophecy-driven ideology, and by the fear that the next war could be the last war. What World War III would actually look like. If the next World War comes, it will not begin with a dramatic declaration, with armies marching in formation, with a single event that everyone recognizes as the start of something unprecedented. It will not look like the world wars of the 20th century, with trenches and tank battles and massive armies clashing on open fields. It will look like the wars that are already happening, the wars in Ukraine, in Gaza, in the Red Sea, in the South China Sea. It will be a war of drones and missiles, of cyber attacks and information warfare, of economic sanctions and energy blackmail. It will be a war that is fought in the shadows as much as in the open, a war that blurs the line between civilian and military, between peace and conflict, between war and not war. And it will be a war that spreads, not through a single decision, but through a cascade of escalations, through miscalculations, through alliances that are tested and found either willing or unwilling to fight. This is the reality of 21st century warfare, and it is the reality that prophecy watchers often miss when they focus on the symbolic battles of Armageddon and Gog and Magog. The next world war will not be a prophecy. It will be a catastrophe. And understanding what it would actually look like is essential for anyone who wants to take the threat seriously. The war in Ukraine provides a template for what great power conflict looks like in the 21st century. It is a war of drones, thousands of them, flying overhead every day, spotting targets, dropping munitions, filming the destruction for audiences back home. It is a war of artillery, with both sides firing thousands of shells a day, flattening cities, turning front lines into lunar landscapes. It is a war of trenches, of mud, of attrition, where advances are measured in meters and casualties are measured in tens of thousands. It is a war of cyber attacks, with hackers targeting power grids, communication networks, financial systems. It is a war of information, with both sides fighting for the narrative, trying to shape how the world sees the conflict. And it is a war that has lasted for years, with no end in sight, because neither side is willing to accept defeat and neither side is capable of achieving a decisive victory. A world war would be this multiplied, not just in one region but in several, with great powers fighting simultaneously in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, with supply chains disrupted, with economies mobilized for war, with the threat of nuclear escalation hanging over everything. The conflict in the Middle East, particularly the shadow war between Israel and Iran and its proxies, provides another piece of the puzzle. A world war would involve not just state armies, but non-state actors. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, militias in Iraq and Syria, all of them armed with advanced weapons supplied by Iran, all of them capable of striking targets far beyond their borders. The Houthis have already shown that they can disrupt global shipping in the Red Sea with missiles and drones, forcing the world's largest navies to deploy to protect commercial vessels. Hezbollah has shown that it can fire rockets at Israeli cities with increasing precision, overwhelming air defense systems. Iran has shown that it can launch direct attacks on Israel from its own territory, using ballistic missiles that can reach their targets in minutes. A regional war that draws in Iran directly would quickly become a global war, as the United States would be forced to defend its allies and its interests, as Gulf states would be targeted by Iranian proxies, as oil prices would spike, and the global economy would shudder. The Taiwan Strait is the third front where a world war could begin. China has been preparing for the possibility of conflict with the United States for years, building a military that is designed to deny American access to the Western Pacific. The Chinese military has invested heavily in anti-ship ballistic missiles, in submarine warfare, in space-based surveillance, in cyber capabilities. The United States has been preparing in turn, repositioning forces, developing new concepts of operations, building alliances in the region. A war over Taiwan would be the most dangerous conflict since World War II. It would involve the two largest economies in the world, two nuclear powers, two countries that are deeply integrated into the global supply chain. The fighting would be intense and brutal, with the Chinese military attempting to prevent American intervention while conducting an amphibious invasion of Taiwan, and the American military attempting to break the blockade and supply Taiwan with weapons and reinforcements. The war would not stay contained to the Taiwan Strait. It would spread to the South China Sea, to the Indian Ocean, to cyberspace, to space itself. And it would trigger a cascade of economic effects, as the global supply chain that runs through the Taiwan Strait is disrupted, as semiconductor production, which is concentrated in Taiwan, is halted, as the world's economies are thrown into recession. These three conflicts, Ukraine, Iran, Israel, Taiwan, are the most likely flashpoints for a world war in 2026. But a world war would not be just the sum of these conflicts. It would be the way they connect, the way they escalate, the way they draw in other nations, other alliances, other interests. A war between Israel and Iran would draw in the United States, which would draw in China, which would see an opportunity to move against Taiwan while American attention is focused elsewhere. A war between China and the United States over Taiwan would draw in Russia, which would see an opportunity to press its advantage in Ukraine while its enemies are distracted. A war that begins in one region would quickly spread to others, as nations take advantage of the chaos to pursue their own interests, as alliances are tested, as old grievances are settled, as the system of international order that has existed since the end of the Cold War collapses. This is what world war would look like in the 21st century. Not a single battlefield where the armies of good and evil gather for a final showdown, but multiple battlefields, multiple conflicts, multiple crises, all feeding on each other, all spinning out of control, all leading toward a destination that no one can predict and that everyone fears. The prophecy narrative, with its focus on Armageddon, on Gog and Magog, on the kings of the East, can make these conflicts seem like something other than what they are. It can make them seem like the fulfillment of a script, like events that were always going to happen, like the inevitable working out of a divine plan. This is comforting in a way, because it removes the uncertainty, the contingency, the human agency that makes war so terrifying. But it is also dangerous, because it can make us passive, can make us accept war as inevitable, can make us less willing to work for peace, less willing to engage in the diplomacy, the negotiations, the hard work of preventing conflict. The wars that are burning in 2026 are not prophecy. They are the result of human decisions, human ambitions, human failures. They can be stopped, or at least contained, by human decisions. The question is whether we have the wisdom, the courage, the will to make those decisions, or whether we will let the prophecy narrative convince us that nothing we do matters, that the end is already written, that all we can do is watch and wait. Are we really in the end times? We began this documentary on the Mount of Olives with Jesus speaking to his disciples about wars and rumors of wars, about famines and earthquakes, about persecution and betrayal. We traveled to Babylon with Daniel, watching empires rise and fall, waiting for the stone cut without hands to shatter the statue of human power. We stood with John on Patmos, watching the Four Horsemen ride, watching the seals break and the trumpets sound, watching the final judgment pour out on a world that had refused to repent. We followed the prophets, Ezekiel with his vision of Gog and Magog, Joel with his northern army, Zechariah with his prophecy of Jerusalem becoming a cup that causes all the peoples around to stagger. We traced the history of interpretation, from the early church seeing Nero as the Antichrist, to the reformers seeing the Pope as the man of lawlessness, to the modern prophecy teachers seeing the European Union, the United Nations, Russia, China, Iran, digital identity, artificial intelligence, as the signs that the end is near. We examined the wars of 2026, the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, the conflict with Hezbollah, the tensions with Iran, the standoff in the Taiwan Strait, the drying Euphrates, the pandemic agreements, the digital identity systems, the artificial intelligence. And we have seen that in every generation there have been wars, there have been plagues, there have been tyrants, there have been signs that convince people that their time was the end. So the question remains, are we really in the end times? The answer, if we are honest, is that we do not know. No one knows. Jesus said that no one knows the day or the hour, not the angels in heaven, not the Son, but only the Father. Anyone who claims to know is claiming a knowledge that Jesus himself said is not available to human beings, and yet the desire to know is overwhelming. The desire to see our own time as special, as uniquely significant, as the moment when history finally reaches its climax, is a desire that has driven human beings for as long as we have had a sense of history. It is a desire that is rooted in the fear that our lives might be meaningless, that our suffering might be random, that the chaos we see around us might not be building toward anything. The end times narrative gives meaning to suffering. It gives shape to chaos. It gives purpose to the present. And it is precisely because it does these things that it is so compelling and so dangerous. The signs that we have examined in this documentary are real. The Euphrates is drying up, not as a supernatural act, but as a result of drought and dams and climate change. But it is drying up. Wars are raging in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. The Strait of Hormuz is a flashpoint that could ignite a regional war. The Taiwan Strait is a flashpoint that could ignite a global war. The Temple Mount is more contested than ever. The red heifers are in Israel. The digital identity systems are being rolled out. The pandemic agreement has been signed. Artificial intelligence is advancing at a pace that is transforming society. These are real events, real developments, real sources of anxiety. And it is not unreasonable to see them as signs that something significant is happening in the world, that history is moving in a direction, that the old order is breaking down. The question is whether they are the signs that the prophets described, or whether they are simply the signs of our own time, as different from the signs of other times as those times were from each other, but no more indicative of the end than the wars of the 20th century, the plagues of the 14th century, the fall of empires in the 5th century. The conclusion of this documentary is not a conclusion in the sense of an answer. It is a conclusion in the sense of a tension that must be held. The tension between watching and waiting, between seeing the signs and not being alarmed, between believing that history has a direction and accepting that we do not know where it leads. The tension between the desire for certainty and the command to trust. The tension between the conviction that God is at work in the world and the humility to admit that we cannot read the mind of God. The tension between the hope that the end will come, that justice will be done, that suffering will end, and the responsibility to work for justice, to alleviate suffering, to build a world that is more like the kingdom we hope for, even if the kingdom is not yet here. This is the tension that the first Christians lived with. They believed that the end was near, but they did not stop loving their neighbors, caring for the poor, building communities, living faithfully in the present. And when the end did not come as soon as they expected, they did not abandon their faith. They deepened it. They learned that watching for the end does not mean ignoring the present. It means living in the present as if the end is near, as if every moment matters, as if every act of love and justice and mercy is a participation in the kingdom that is coming. The wars of 2026 are real. The suffering is real. The anxiety is real. And it is right to ask whether these are the signs that the prophets saw. But it is also right to remember that every generation has asked the same question, and that the answer has always been the same. The end is near. It has always been near. It is always near. The command to watch is not a command to calculate, not a command to predict, not a command to panic. It is a command to live with urgency, to live with intention, to live with love, because we do not know how much time we have. Whether the end comes tomorrow or in 1,000 years, the call is the same. Be faithful. Be ready. Do not be afraid. The final word is not the word of judgment. It is the word of hope. The kingdom is coming. It is already here, in the hearts of those who believe, in the communities of those who love, in the acts of mercy that shine in the darkness. And it will come in its fullness at the time that God has appointed, whether that time is now or later, or much later than we can imagine. Our task is not to know when. Our task is to be ready when it comes. If you made it this far, let us know in the comments below if you think we are living in the end times, or is this just another chapter in the long history of generations who were certain they were the last? And who do you think the Antichrist is? Make sure to hit the like button, click the hype button to help others find this video, and subscribe for more deep dives into the most ominous topics shaping our time. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.